The morning Abigail Hale arrived in Dusk Creek, Nevada, with 43 cents in her coat pocket and a leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. 3 men laughed at her from the porch of the general store, and she decided right then and there that she would give every one of them reason to stop laughing before the year was through. It was the spring of 1878, and the Nevada high desert was in the middle of one of the worst droughts anyone in Dusk Creek could remember. The town itself was nothing remarkable. A scattering of sun-bleached buildings along a packed dirt road, a water trough that always seemed half empty, and a population of about 300 souls who spent most of their time worrying about cattle prices and praying for rain. Abigail had come west from St. Louis on a combination of train and stagecoach, following a letter she had received from her late father's attorney informing her that she had inherited a modest sum of money and a land deed. A plot of 40 acres somewhere outside of Dusk Creek that her father had won in a card game before he died. She had not expected much. Her father, God rest his soul, had not been a man known for his good fortune in business matters, but she had expected something, anything. She had expected the land to at least resemble land. What she found, when the attorney, a fidgety little man named Mr. Prout, finally drove her out to see it in a rickety buckboard, was a stretch of alkaline flats baking under the Nevada sun, dotted with scrub brush and a few skeletal Joshua trees, bisected by a dry creek bed that looked as though it had not seen water in living memory, and sitting at the foot of a rocky ridge that cast a shadow over the eastern third of the property for most of the day. There was no structure on it, no well, no fence post, nothing but cracked earth and the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like abandonment. "I'm sorry, Miss Hale," Mr. Prout said, mopping his forehead with a damp handkerchief. "As I understand it, the man your father won it from considered himself quite lucky to be rid of it." Abigail stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, her boots already dusty, the afternoon sun pressing down on her like a flat iron. She was 26 years old. She had a seamstress's calloused fingers, a schoolteacher's precise way of thinking, and a stubbornness she had inherited from a mother who had crossed the Ohio River during a flood in January to attend her own wedding and had not complained once about the wet skirts. Abigail looked at those 40 acres of nothing and made a decision. "How much water does that creek bed run in a wet year?" she asked. Mr. Prout blinked. I'm not entirely certain. Perhaps. Find out," she said. "And find me a place to stay tonight. I'll be here for a while." She took a room at the only boarding house in Dusk Creek, run by a stout widow named Mrs. Garfield, who charged 50 cents a week and served breakfast that was mostly biscuits with occasional ham. On her second morning in town, Abigail walked into the feed store to ask about seed prices and soil conditions in the valley, and that was when she first saw Isaiah Doyle. He was arguing about fence posts. Not shouting, exactly. The man did not seem the shouting type, but arguing with the kind of quiet, immovable certainty that made every word land like a dropped stone. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his temples from the heat, and a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same red sandstone that built the ridge behind her property. He wore a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands, she noticed immediately, were the hands of a man who worked his own land rather than paying someone else to work it for him. "I'm telling you, Hatch," he was saying to the man behind the counter, a slow-blinking fellow with a red mustache, "those cedar posts you sold me last month are already splitting. I need oak and I need them by Friday. Oak's expensive, Doyle. Oak holds. I'll take expensive over rebuilding the same fence twice." He turned to leave and nearly walked directly into Abigail, who was standing just inside the doorway, and who, to her own mild annoyance, had to take a quick step back to avoid the collision. He caught himself, and for a moment they were simply looking at each other, brown eyes meeting gray-green ones in the particular way of two people who have just narrowly avoided an undignified introduction. "Pardon me," he said, and his voice carried genuine apology rather than the reflexive kind. "I didn't see you." "You were occupied," she said simply. He gave a slight nod, and she stepped to the side and he walked out, and that was the whole of their first meeting. She would think about it later and find it almost comically unromantic, which she supposed was appropriate for what turned out to be the beginning of the most important relationship of her life. She learned his name from Mrs. Garfield that evening, between bites of biscuit. Isaiah Doyle, the widow said, nodding with the authority of a woman who kept excellent track of her neighbors. Runs the Doyle Ranch about 6 miles east of town. Biggest operation in the county, near as I can figure. His father built it from nothing, came out here in the 50s with 2 horses and more grit than sense, according to the old-timers. Isaiah took it over when his father passed about 4 years back. Good man, serious maybe, but fair. He doesn't cheat people, which is more than you can say for most. Does he own any land near the Western Ridge? Abigail asked. Mrs. Garfield set down her fork. He owns just about everything around the Western Ridge, honey. Except for that stretch of alkaline flats that used to belong to old Chester Briggs before he lost it in a card game. She paused. Wait, is that the land you've inherited? 40 acres, Abigail confirmed. The widow looked at her for a long, considered moment. Child, she said at last, with the gentleness of someone delivering a difficult diagnosis, that land is worthless. Everyone in the county knows it. Chester Briggs tried to graze cattle on it and lost half his herd to the alkaline. The soil won't hold crops. There's no water. Doyle wouldn't even buy it when Chester offered it at practically nothing. Said Abigail, which was not agreement. The following week she walked out to the Doyle Ranch. It was a proper ranch. The kind that told you immediately that serious people had worked it for a serious amount of time. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of weathered timber and river rock, with a long porch running the full width of the front. Behind it sat a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, several corrals, and a network of fencing that stretched out over gentle hills covered in dry but serviceable grass. There were perhaps 200 head of cattle visible from the gate, and a handful of cowboys working in the near corral with a young horse that was expressing strong opinions about the saddle being strapped to its back. Isaiah Doyle was sitting on the porch steps going through what appeared to be an account book when she arrived at the gate, and he looked up with the particular alert stillness of a man who has taught himself to always notice who is coming onto his property. He recognized her. She could see it in the slight change around his eyes. He stood, which she noted because not every man in 1878 stood when a woman approached and closed his account book. Miss Hale, she said. Abigail Hale. I own the 40 acres of alkaline flats adjacent to your western pasture. Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, but close. Chester Briggs's old plot. My father's plot, now mine, she corrected pleasantly. I've come to ask you some questions about the land if you're willing. You know this valley better than anyone from what I'm told. He studied her for a moment the way you study weather on the horizon, not unfriendly but measuring. Then he stepped down off the porch. What kind of questions? Water questions mostly, she said. Soil questions. Whether the alkaline content of that creek bed has ever been tested, or whether everyone has just assumed the worst and never checked. That stopped him. He looked at her with what she would come to recognize as his version of genuine interest, a slight sharpening of focus, the way a person looks when they have heard something unexpected that strikes them as potentially worth knowing. You're serious, he said. I walked 43 miles of Nebraska prairie to get to a train station when I was 16 because my mother was sick and we needed a doctor, she said. I am always serious. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Come in. I'll put some coffee on. They sat at the long wooden table in his kitchen, a kitchen that was clean and functional, and showed the slight disarray of a man who cooked for himself, and did it adequately but without enthusiasm. And she asked her questions. He answered them with the directness she had sensed in him from the first, neither padding his knowledge nor hiding it. The creek bed, he told her, had in fact run water as recently as 12 years ago, in a particularly wet winter. It was fed by snowmelt from the ridge, and in good years the water table in that area sat relatively close to the surface. The alkaline content of the soil was genuine, but it was concentrated mostly in the top 6 inches or so. He knew this because he had once considered purchasing the land himself and had done some preliminary assessment before concluding that the cost of remediation was too high to justify. The eastern ridge created a wind break that would actually be beneficial in summer, he said, if a person could get something to grow there. Abigail listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes, which she was. "Why didn't you buy it?" she asked, "if the water table is workable?" "Because fixing alkaline soil takes years of work, multiple plantings of crops like barley and rye grass to break it up, and a significant amount of gypsum or sulfur treatment," he said. "And at the end of that, you're still on 40 acres that won't run enough cattle to make a profitable ranch. The numbers don't work." "I'm not planning to run cattle," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I was a seamstress in St. Louis," she said, "but before that I spent 3 years helping my aunt run a kitchen garden that supplied 2 hotels and a sanatorium with vegetables. I know how to grow things. I want to try lavender." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that follows an unexpected statement. "Lavender," he repeated, "and kitchen herbs, and possibly a small orchard if the soil can be brought along far enough. Lavender is particularly drought-tolerant once established, and it actually does well in somewhat alkaline soil better than most crops. The essential oil market is growing. There's a perfumery in San Francisco that is paying significant prices for domestic lavender oil, and dried lavender bundles sell well to general stores and haberdashers all along the rail lines." She folded her hands on the table. "I have done considerable reading on the subject." Isaiah Doyle looked at her across the table for a long moment. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and somewhere out in the yard one of his dogs barked twice at something and then went quiet. "That's either the smartest idea I've heard in a long time," he said slowly, "or you've been reading the wrong books." "Possibly both," she admitted, "which is why I'd appreciate any information you can give me about the land." He gave her more information. A great deal more, in fact, about the drainage patterns in the western flats, about the location of a rock formation along the creek bed that had once been used to redirect water flow by the Paiute people who had known this land for generations before any of them arrived, about the soil composition in the lower sections of the property, which might be less alkaline than the upper flats. He drew her a rough map on the back of an old feed receipt, which she folded and put in her coat pocket. She thanked him and stood to leave. "Miss Hale," he said as she reached the door. She turned. He was still sitting at the table, turning his empty coffee cup in his hands in a way that suggested he was considering saying something he had not entirely decided on. "That ridge cuts off most of your morning sun on the eastern third of the property." "I know," she said. "I'll plant the lavender on the western 2/3 and put a kitchen garden and root cellar into the shadow side. Lavender prefers full sun. Roots don't mind the shade." He nodded once. "Good plan." She left. On the walk back to town, she allowed herself one small, private smile. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of Abigail Hale's life, which was saying something given that her life had not been particularly gentle up to that point. She spent the remains of her inheritance, a sum that would not have impressed anyone, on basic tools, seed, a small amount of gypsum for initial soil treatment, a second-hand army canvas tent, and a used but serviceable cast-iron stove small enough to fit through the tent flap. She moved out to the 40 acres on a Tuesday morning with all of this loaded in a borrowed wagon, set up her tent on the least alkaline section of soil she could find near the creek bed, and began. She dug. She tested. She hauled water in barrels from a spring she found a half-mile up the ridge trail, which was backbreaking work that took 2 to 3 hours every morning before she could begin anything else. She broke up the top soil and worked in the gypsum by hand and with a rented cultivator, row by row, starting with the section she had decided would be her first lavender bed. She planted rye grass in the worst of the alkaline sections to begin the long process of breaking up the salt deposits, watering it faithfully from her barrel supply. She built a small fire break around her camp with rocks from the creek bed. She located the old water redirect formation the Paiute had built and spent 4 days carefully cleaning it out and testing whether it could be made functional again. She was doing exactly that, standing knee-deep in the dry creek bed hauling rocks, when Isaiah Doyle rode up on a bay gelding one afternoon in early May. He sat his horse at the edge of the property and watched her for a moment. Then he dismounted, tied his horse to a scrub tree, and walked down to the creek bed without being invited. "You found the old diversion wall," he said. "3 days ago," she said, not stopping what she was doing. "If I can clear the remaining blockage and reinforce the lower section, it should be able to redirect any seasonal runoff directly across the southern third of the property. It might not run every year, but in a good snow year it could make the difference between hauling water and having water." He crouched at the edge of the creek bed and examined the rock formation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took off his hat, rolled up his sleeve a bit more, stepped down into the creek bed beside her and began moving rocks. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You have your own ranch to manage," she said. "My foreman can handle the afternoon," he said. "Pass me that one with the flat face." She passed him the rock, and they worked side by side in the dry creek bed for 3 hours until the sun began to drop toward the western hills. And in those 3 hours they spoke very little but established something between them that was more substantial and more honest than most conversations she had ever had. There was a language she was learning that existed in shared work, in the synchronization of two people who were both competent and who recognized competence in each other. And it said things that words in a parlor never quite managed. When they climbed out of the creek bed, as the light turned gold and amber, he looked at the cleared and reinforced diversion wall with a satisfied expression and then looked at her with something more complicated. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. She looked down. She had torn open her palm at some point on a sharp rock and had not noticed through the exertion. Blood had dried in a dark line across her hand. "Oh," she said, "I'll clean it at camp. I have a medical kit in my saddlebag," he said, already walking to his horse. She sat on a creek bed rock while he cleaned and wrapped the cut with clean linen strips from a small kit that spoke to a man who was prepared for the inevitable injuries of ranch life. His hands were careful. She watched his face while he worked, the concentration there, the slight furrow between his brows, and felt something warm and inconvenient begin in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "It's a good diversion wall," he said. "Whoever built it originally knew what they were doing." He tied off the bandage and did not immediately let go of her hand. He looked down at it in his, and she could see him become aware of the fact that he was still holding it, and she did not pull away. The moment stretched, golden and warm in the late afternoon light. Then he released her hand and stood and said, in a tone that was very carefully ordinary, "I'll check on the progress next week." "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said, and rode away. He came back 4 days later. He brought lumber. Not ostentatiously. He arrived with a small flat wagon loaded with cut timber pieces and explained, in the matter-of-fact way of a man determined not to make a grand gesture out of something, that he had extra from a fence project, and that it would otherwise sit in his barn taking up space. She accepted it without making a fuss because she recognized that he needed her too, and because the lumber was genuinely useful, and because she had been lying awake in her tent thinking about whether she could afford to build even a basic structure before the summer heat arrived in earnest. "I can put up a basic frame," he said, "if you want help." "I want help," she said, which cost her something. She had spent years learning to want nothing from people who might not give it, and he nodded and they got to work. He came on 3 of the following Sundays and 2 Saturday afternoons, and by the middle of June there was a small but solid one-room structure standing on Abigail's property, with a loft for sleeping and a stone foundation that would keep the worst of the heat from baking through the floor. He taught her how to cut proper dovetail joints for the corners because they held better than nails alone, and she showed him the irrigation channel she had designed to direct water from the creek diversion across the lavender beds, using a gravity-fed system she had worked out on paper during the long evenings in her tent. He studied the design and made one suggestion about the angle of the main channel that improved it considerably, and she incorporated the change without ego because it was clearly a better idea, and he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to treasure, that particular look of a man who keeps being surprised by someone and keeps being pleased about being surprised. The lavender seedlings she had started in salvaged wooden crates went into the ground in late May, in careful rows across the western two-thirds of the property. The first 2 weeks were anxious. She watered each plant by hand from her barrel supply, crouching in the Nevada sun with aching shoulders, willing the tiny seedlings to take hold. Several did not make it, but most did, and by mid-June there was a fragile but definite carpet of silver green growing across what had been, 2 months ago, nothing but cracked alkaline earth. Isaiah saw it for the first time on a Sunday afternoon when he arrived to help her lay the final beam on the root cellar she had begun digging into the shaded eastern slope. He came around the corner of her new building and stopped walking. "Lord," he said softly. Abigail came to stand beside him. The lavender was small, still, tentative, but it covered both beds in a continuous sweep that caught the afternoon light and gave back a silvery shimmer that seemed almost impossible against the harsh landscape around it. "It's taking," she said, and could not entirely keep the emotion out of her voice. 2 months of daily, grinding, muscle-burning labor, and it was taking. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, it is." And she felt him look at her instead of the lavender. She did not look back because she was not ready to. But she felt it, the way you feel the warmth of a fire you have not turned to face. The town of Dust Creek had been watching all of this with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that leaned, in those early months, considerably more toward the latter. Women who ran their own homesteads were not unheard of in the West. The Homestead Act had made that more possible since 1862, but a woman alone, on that particular piece of land, attempting something as seemingly fanciful as a lavender farm, was a subject of considerable commentary at the general store and the Dust Creek saloon. Most of the commentary was unkind, delivered in the particular tone of people who mistake caution for wisdom. A man named Virgil Hennessy, who ran a cattle operation on the northern edge of the valley and who had the disposition of someone perpetually aggrieved, was particularly free with his opinions. He had wanted to purchase the alkaline flats himself at one point, intending to use them as a dry grazing buffer, and the fact that they had gone instead to a young woman from St. Louis who was trying to grow flowers on them struck him as both a personal insult and a cosmic indignity. "Doyle's wasting his Sundays playing handyman for a woman who will be gone by fall," Abigail heard him say one afternoon at the general store when he did not know she was in the next aisle. "That land's alkaline through and through. Nothing's going to grow on it. She'll use up whatever her father left her, figure out she's beaten, and take the next stage back east." Abigail selected a tin of coffee and a small bag of dried beans from the shelf, set them on the counter, paid for them, and walked out without saying a word to Virgil Hennessy. She had learned from her mother, and from years of being a woman in circumstances that assumed her limitations, that the most effective response to a man who did not believe in her was simply to continue doing the thing he did not believe she could do. She told Isaiah about it that evening. He had stayed late helping her shore up the roof of the root cellar, and had accepted her offer of coffee as the sun went down, sitting on the stone step of her new door while she sat on an overturned crate nearby. The Nevada sky in the summer evening was a thing of almost theatrical beauty, deep indigo at the zenith, burning amber at the rim of the world, and they sat in it comfortably, the way two people sit together when they have stopped needing to fill every silence. "Hennessy's a fool," Isaiah said without particular heat. "He may also be right," she said. "About the fall, I mean. I don't know yet whether this is going to work." "It's working," he said, and he said it the way he said the things he was certain of, simply, without ornamentation. She looked at him then. The amber light was kind to his face, softened the seriousness of it, showed her the warmth she had been learning was always there beneath the reserve. He was looking out across the lavender beds, but she had the feeling he was aware of being looked at. "Why do you keep coming back here?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, still looking at the lavender, "Because when I'm not here I spend a good deal of time wondering how things are going." It was not a declaration. It was not even close to a declaration. But from Isaiah Doyle she had learned, the distance between what he said and what he meant was often very small, and what he had said carried enough weight in the quiet evening air that she felt it settle into her chest and stay there. "Isaiah," she said softly. He turned and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the evening light burned between them like a third presence. Then his dog, Scratch, a rangy brindle hound who had taken to following Isaiah out to her property on these visits, and who had the worst timing in the Nevada territory, galloped up from the direction of the creek bed with an enthusiastic bark, and the moment dissolved into laughter, which was, Abigail decided later, perhaps not the worst way for it to end. Summer deepened. The lavender grew. It grew with a will that surprised even Abigail, who had believed in it from the beginning. The gypsum treatment and the rye grass had done their work faster than she had dared hope in the sections she had prepared most carefully. By July the first bed was putting out long fragrant spikes, not yet ready for harvest, but unmistakably, powerfully there, filling the evening air with a scent that stopped people in their tracks when the wind came from the west. Mrs. Garfield drove out to see it in her buggy one Sunday and stood at the edge of the lavender bed with tears in her eyes, which she attributed to the wind. The second bed was coming in strong. The kitchen herb garden on the shaded eastern slope, rosemary, thyme, sage, chamomile, was established and already producing enough that Abigail had begun selling small bundles at the general store in town, which supplemented her dwindling cash reserves and kept her fed. The rye grass in the alkaline sections was breaking up the salt deposits exactly as she had hoped, and she had begun preparing those sections for the following year's expansion of the lavender beds. And the diversion wall in the creek bed performed its first miracle in early August, when a brief but intense thunderstorm in the ridge above sent a rush of water down the dry creek that the cleaned and reinforced wall caught and directed across the southern third of her property, filling the channel she had dug and running across the ground in a silver sheet that soaked into the dry earth like a prayer answered. Abigail stood in the middle of it in her boots with the water running over them, watching her irrigation channel fill for the first time, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and sobbed once, just once, because she had worked so hard for this and had been afraid for so long that it would not come. Isaiah was there. He had ridden out when the storm broke, which told her something she did not entirely know what to do with, because it meant he had thought immediately of her property and her channel, and whether they would perform as designed. He stood at the edge of the flowing water and watched her standing in the middle of it, and when she turned around he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and tender. She walked toward him through the water, and when she reached dry ground she stopped very close to him, closer than the situation strictly required, and looked up at him. He was very still in the way of someone who is very aware of exactly how close a particular person is standing. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed, and his voice was rough at the edges. She put her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, her hand on his forearm, fingers resting on the cotton of his sleeve. But he looked down at it and then looked at her, and something shifted in him, visibly, the way a door shifts when a latch finally releases. "Abigail," he said, and the way he said her name was entirely different from every previous time. "I know," she said, because she did. He reached up and covered her hand with his. They stood there in the rain-cleaned air with the water running in her channel beside them, the smell of wet earth and lavender rising around them, and he held her hand against his arm like something precious. He kissed her for the first time 3 days later. It was not dramatic. He had ridden out on a weekday morning, which he had never done before, and he had come around the corner of her building while she was on a ladder fixing a warped shutter, and he had looked up at her and said, "Could you come down from there for a minute?" She had climbed down. He was standing close in the deliberate way, not the accidental kind, and he reached up and took a cedar chip out of her hair that the shutter work had put there. And then he kept his hand against the side of her face, and she kept very still and looked at him, and he kissed her with the same careful, certain quality he brought to everything he did. And it was soft and warm and tasted like the coffee he had brought in a canteen, and it lasted exactly as long as a first kiss ought to before he pulled back and looked at her. "All right," he said, as though settling something. "All right," she agreed. She could feel the smile on her face like sunshine, and she did not try to reduce it. He stayed for dinner that evening. She made biscuits and salt pork and greens from her garden, and they sat at her small table in the new building and talked for 3 hours in the way of people who have been quietly collecting things to say to each other for months. She learned things she had not known, that he had been engaged once, 5 years ago, to a woman from Carson City who had found the ranch too isolated and the work too unending and had gone back east, that he had 2 younger sisters, both married and living in California, that he had taught himself to read Spanish from a dictionary and a Bible because several of his best ranch hands spoke it, and he felt it was unfair to make them all accommodate him. She told him about St. Louis, about her mother's death when she was 19, about the seamstress work that had kept her housed and fed, but had felt like wearing someone else's life, about the letter from Mr. Prout and the train west and the morning she had stood on 40 acres of alkaline nothing and decided it was enough to start from. "You never doubted it would work?" he asked. "Every single day," she said. "I just didn't let the doubt vote." He looked at her across the small table in the lamplight and shook his head slowly, not negatively, more like someone marveling at something they have stumbled upon. "You're remarkable," he said. She felt the word like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "I'm determined," she said. "There's a difference." "Not always," he said. September arrived with a shift in the air that the old-timers called the turning, and Abigail Hale harvested her first lavender. It was not a large harvest. The plants were in their first year, and she had not expected volume, but it was real, and it was fragrant, and she harvested every spike by hand over the course of 4 days with her fingers stained purple and her hair smelling of lavender oil from morning to night. She bundled it herself, small tight bundles tied with twine she had dyed a dark green, and she packed a portion into crates padded with dried grass for shipping and took the rest to town. The general store in Dust Creek had never smelled like lavender before. When Abigail walked in with 2 large baskets of bundled lavender and laid them on the counter, Hatch, the slow-blinking man with the red mustache, stared at them and then stared at her. "I'd like to sell these through the store," she said. 20 cents a bundle, you keep 5. I'll resupply weekly for as long as I have stock." Hatch picked up a bundle, held it to his nose, and his expression underwent a transformation that was almost comical in its completeness. "Lord above," he said softly. The bundles sold out in 2 days. She restocked and they sold again. She sent her first crate of dried lavender to a dry goods merchant in Reno by wagon freight, with a letter explaining what it was and its potential market. She sent a separate, carefully composed letter to the perfumery in San Francisco she had researched in St. Louis, offering a sample of her lavender oil. She had produced a small amount through a rudimentary steam process using her cast iron stove and copper tubing, salvaged from a defunct mining claim, and asking about their interest in establishing a supply relationship. The answer from the perfumery in San Francisco arrived in October, and it said, among other things, that the oil sample she had sent was of a quality that compared favorably with imported French lavender, and that they would be very interested in discussing a formal supply arrangement contingent on her ability to scale production. She sat on her stone doorstep and read the letter 3 times. Then she walked the 6 miles to the Doyle ranch because she did not have a horse yet and could not wait the 2 days until Isaiah's next scheduled visit, and she arrived dusty and slightly breathless to find him in the near corral examining a horse's hoof, and she said from the gate, "Isaiah, they want my lavender oil. San Francisco." He straightened up and turned around and looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not quite seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy on her behalf, the kind that has no jealousy in it. He came to the gate and opened it, and she held out the letter, and he read it, and then he looked at her and said, "You did it." "Not yet," she said. "I need to scale up. I need a proper still for the oil, more beds, better irrigation for dry years. I still have so much to do." "You did it," he said again firmly, and took the letter from her hands and looked at it once more, and then he looked at her, and she saw in his face that he was not just proud of what she had accomplished, he was looking at her. She could feel the difference. "Come in," he said. "You walked 6 miles. At least let me feed you before you start planning the next phase." The dinner that night in his kitchen was different from the dinners they had shared before. There was an ease between them now, a settled, comfortable ease layered over a warmth that neither of them was trying to contain anymore, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight after the meal and talked about the future with a naturalness that suggested they had both quietly, without announcement, begun thinking of it as a shared thing. "I need a better well," she said. "My barrel system works, but it's not sustainable for a larger operation." "I know a man in Elko who drills wells," Isaiah said. "Good work, fair prices. I'll give you his name. And I need to learn more about the steam distillation process. The method I've been using is too small and imprecise." "There's a German fellow in Carson City who has a proper copper still he uses for different purposes," Isaiah said, with a slight diplomatic pause. "He might be willing to make you one, or show you the design so you can have one made." She laughed. He had the most honest face she had ever seen, and when he was being delicate about something it was utterly transparent. "Are you helping me set up a lavender distillery or a whiskey operation?" she asked. "The principles are similar," he said, entirely straight-faced, "though I am told lavender oil smells considerably better." She laughed again, and he smiled. He had a smile that he did not deploy carelessly, and when it came it was worth the wait, and they sat in the lamplight and made plans. He asked her to marry him in November, in the most Isaiah Doyle way imaginable, which was to say practically and directly, and with no fanfare whatsoever, and an underlying seriousness that made the lack of fanfare feel like sincerity rather than deficiency. She was on her property, doing the autumn preparation work on the lavender beds, cutting back the spent plants to the proper height to encourage growth the following spring. And he had ridden out on a weekday morning again, which she had come to recognize as a signal that something was on his mind. He helped her for a while in silence, working the row next to hers, and then he straightened up and said, "Abigail, will you marry me?" She kept her pruning shears in her hand and looked at him across the lavender row. He met her eyes without flinching, which she had always respected about him. "I'm not going to move to your ranch," she said. "I won't leave this property. This is mine and I intend to keep developing it." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to. We could build a proper house here, bigger than what you have. I'm at the ranch most days and could be back here evenings. It's 6 miles. My foreman is good." She thought about this. Not about whether she loved him. That question had answered itself in August in the rain and had been confirming the answer in increasingly compelling ways ever since. She thought about practicalities, because she was her mother's daughter and love alone did not put roofs over one's head. "You'd need to be genuinely comfortable with the fact that this is my operation," she said carefully. "My decisions, my plans, my failures if they come. I'm not looking for a business partner. I'm looking for a husband who is not going to manage me." "Abigail," he said, with the quiet certainty that was entirely his, "I watched you redesign a 500-year-old Paiute water system, convince alkaline Nevada desert to grow lavender, and sell the oil to San Francisco before you've been here 8 months. The last thing on this earth I intend to do is manage you." She was quiet for a moment. "Also," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was softer, "I have not been able to think about anything very much except you since approximately the second Tuesday in May, which is both inconvenient and, I've decided, not something I want to remedy." "Which Tuesday was that?" "The one where you were standing in the creek bed moving rocks and you argued with me about the angle of the diversion channel and you were right and I was wrong and I found that—" He paused, searching for the word unexpectedly wonderful. She pressed her lips together against a smile that was too large for the circumstances. "Isaiah." "Yes. Yes," she said. He was still for a moment. "Then, yes, you'll marry me. Or yes in response to something else." "Yes, I will marry you," she said, and now she let the smile loose entirely, and he crossed the lavender row in 2 steps and put his arms around her in the November light, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and the lavender smelled around them, and the ridge made its long shadow across the eastern slope, and it felt like being exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in January of 1879, in the small white church in Dust Creek, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Garfield, Mr. Pruitt, Hatch from the feed store, Isaiah's foreman and several of his ranch hands, and approximately half of the town, because word had gotten around that Isaiah Doyle was marrying the woman with the lavender farm and people were curious. Virgil Hennessy was not in attendance. Abigail wore a dress she had made herself, dark blue wool with white collar and cuffs, practical but beautiful. The kind of dress a woman makes when she knows how to sew and wants to feel like herself rather than a decoration. Isaiah wore his good suit and his best boots, and had clearly made an effort with his hair that he would have denied making if asked. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the aisle, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Every careful reserve dissolved, every wall down, and she walked toward that expression like walking toward a hearth on a cold evening. They said their vows plainly and clearly, and when the minister pronounced them married and Isaiah kissed her in the filtered winter light of the church, someone in the back pew, she thought it was Mrs. Garfield, made a small sound that was not entirely unlike a sob. They did not have much of a honeymoon because there was work to be done. This suited them both. Isaiah's contribution to the homestead in the months following their marriage was precisely what he had promised: support without management, labor without direction, and a steady practical intelligence that she found she could think alongside rather than around. He had her well dug in February by the man from Elko, and it found water at 40 feet, which was 4 feet higher than even the optimistic estimates, and Isaiah stood at the edge of the well shaft with his hands on his hips and said "good," in a way that she knew, by now, meant considerably more than the word. He helped her build the new house through the late winter and early spring, a proper 2-story structure this time, with a covered front porch and 4 rooms and a kitchen large enough to contain the work she did there. His ranch hands helped on the weekends, and several of them turned out to be genuinely skilled with wood and stone, and the house went up quickly and solidly, and by April it was standing. Abigail moved the copper still she had commissioned from the German man in Carson City into a dedicated outbuilding behind the house, and in the spring, when the lavender came into bloom in its 2nd year, more of it now, fuller and stronger, and covering both original beds plus a third she had established in a newly remediated section. She began distilling oil in earnest. The lavender in its 2nd year was something to see. The people of Dust Creek had been watching the progress of Abigail Hale's Abigail Doyle's now, though she often answered to either Homestead with increasing interest as the months had gone on. The initial skepticism had not disappeared entirely, but it had been significantly diluted by the evidence. The bundles of lavender at the general store had become a staple. People drove in from neighboring ranches to buy them. Mrs. Garfield used them in all her rooms and credited them with keeping moths away. The new doctor in town bought 2 bundles a week for his office and said they had a calming effect on anxious patients. When the lavender came into full bloom in the spring of 1879, visible from the road that ran past the western edge of the property, in a long sweep of purple that shimmered in the Nevada breeze and sent its perfume halfway to town on a good day, even the most committed skeptics found themselves driving past slowly with their windows down. A journalist from the Nevada State Journal in Carson City heard about it from someone and rode out in June to see for himself. He was a young man with spectacles and an eager manner who spent an afternoon walking the property with Abigail while she explained the soil remediation process, the irrigation system, the distillation operation, and the market relationships she had developed. He took extensive notes. He was particularly interested in the Paiute diversion wall in the creek bed, and Abigail spoke about it with the care she brought to the subject. The knowledge of this land that the Paiute people had carried for generations before the settlers arrived, the injustice of their displacement from it, the debt she felt she owed to that prior knowledge, and the respect she tried to bring to its use. "Most people out here wouldn't think to mention that," the journalist said. "Most people out here don't want to think about whose land it was before," she said. "But the wall works because they understood this watershed better than anyone. It would be dishonest to use it and not say so." Isaiah, who had been listening from the porch with a cup of coffee, looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his private one, the one he kept for moments when she said something that struck him straight through the careful armor he carried. He never interrupted these moments, and she never performed for them. They happened the way real things happen, without contrivance. The article ran in the Nevada State Journal in July of 1879 under the headline, "From Worthless Flats to Fragrant Fortune, A Woman's Remarkable Homestead in Dust Creek." It described the lavender farm in enthusiastic detail, quoted Abigail extensively, and contained a sentence near the end that read, "What was until recently considered the most worthless piece of land in Churchill County has become, under Mrs. Doyle's transformation, the most talked-about homestead in the Nevada Territory." Abigail read it at the kitchen table in the new house and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Most talked-about homestead in the Nevada Territory seems a bit strong." "Have you looked at our road lately?" Isaiah said. "People drive by slowly just to see the lavender." "That's not last Sunday. Hatch from the feed store came out here specifically to tell me that people have been asking him how to get to the lavender farm. He said he started calling it the directions to the purple place because it's easier." She put the paper down. "The purple place." "You could have the name painted on the gate," he said, and there was amusement in his voice, warm and easy, the way it had become between them. "I am not naming my homestead the purple place," she said. "You could call it Hale and Fragrant," he offered. She threw the newspaper at him. He caught it laughing, and the sound of his laughing in the kitchen of the house they had built together was something she collected carefully, like the fragile things that matter most. The article brought visitors. Not just local visitors. A woman from Sacramento wrote asking about purchasing lavender oil for a soap-making business she was starting. A dry goods merchant from Virginia City sent a representative to discuss a standing order for dried lavender bundles. A rancher's wife from Washoe County drove all the way to Dust Creek specifically to walk through the lavender beds, because her daughter back east had written asking if such a place actually existed in Nevada, and she wanted to be able to say she had seen it herself. Abigail handled all of this with a matter-of-fact efficiency that Isaiah admired, and that occasionally made him laugh. She had no interest whatsoever in the social performance of success, only in its practical management. She wrote contracts in a clear hand. She kept meticulous accounts. She expanded the third lavender bed into a fourth when the soil preparation in the next section was ready, and she began testing a small plot of culinary herbs tarragon, lavender mint, a variety of basil to see whether the soil would support a dried herb operation alongside the lavender. Virgil Hennessy, to no one's surprise, attempted to cause trouble. He came by the property one August afternoon with 2 of his men, riding the fence line that separated her property from the patch of open range he used for his cattle. He claimed loudly from horseback that her irrigation channel was drawing water from the watershed in a way that infringed on his cattle's water access, which was not true, but which was the kind of claim that could tie up a person's time and energy if properly escalated. Isaiah was present, which was fortunate for the quality of the conversation. He stepped off the porch and walked to the fence line and said, in the quiet manner that most people found considerably more persuasive than shouting, "Virgil, my wife's irrigation channel uses water from the seasonal runoff through the diversion wall in the old creek bed. That water has no legal connection to your cattle's grazing rights. If you have a formal complaint, put it in writing and deliver it to the county office. They'll dismiss it, but you're welcome to try." Hennessy stared at him, then at Abigail, who had come to stand beside Isaiah at the fence, and who met his gaze with the specific quality of calm she had developed, not aggressive, simply immovable. "That land was supposed to be useless," Hennessy said, and in his voice was something almost like injury, the bewildered anger of a man whose certainty about the world has been undermined by the impertinence of events. "It is my land," Abigail said pleasantly. "You're welcome to visit properly any time and I'll show you around. But if you're here to make claims, we'd prefer you do it through the proper channels, as my husband said." Hennessy looked at them for a moment longer, said something under his breath and rode away. He never made a formal claim. He also never drove past the property slowly to smell the lavender, which was his loss. The fall of 1879 brought the first significant snowfall the valley had seen in several years, and the creek bed ran in the spring of 1880 with more water than anyone could remember, and the diversion wall performed beautifully, and the irrigation channels filled. And the lavender went into its 3rd year with that moisture in the ground beneath it, and produced a bloom so full and so dense that Abigail stood at the edge of the first bed in early June, and felt she might not be able to hold all of it, the purple stretching before her, the air so thick with scent it was almost visible, the ridge casting its familiar shadow on the root-cellar slope, the new house behind her with its covered porch and its kitchen window open to let the smell in. Isaiah came up beside her. He slipped his hand into hers without preamble, the way married people do when they no longer need to announce the gesture. "3rd year," he said. "3rd year," she confirmed. "We need to hire help for the harvest. I can't do this volume alone anymore." "I know 2 women from town who asked Mrs. Garfield about harvest work," he said. "I can ask tomorrow. And I want to train someone to run the still. I've been the only one who knows the process, and that's not sustainable. Also true," he squeezed her hand. "Abigail, are you happy?" She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the serious, open attention he gave to the things that mattered most to him, and she felt the question settle on her with its full weight, which was considerable, because she had not been asked that question by anyone who genuinely wanted the answer in a very long time, and because the answer was one she had worked hard to earn. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said. "I am also the most tired I have ever been, and the most behind on my correspondence, and I have a blister on my left heel from yesterday's work boots that is genuinely impressive. But yes, I am happy." He put his arm around her and pressed a kiss to her temple, and she leaned into him, and the lavender moved in the morning breeze around them. She told him she was pregnant in October of 1880. She did it in the way she did most important things, directly, without preamble, sitting across from him at the breakfast table before either of them had finished their first cup of coffee. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "Sometime in the spring, I think. I'd estimate May." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. His face did something that she did not have an adequate word for. It opened, utterly, in a way she had not seen it open before, past every careful guard he kept, and what was there was so transparent and so large that she felt her eyes fill unexpectedly. "Abigail," he said, and his voice was rough, "Don't cry," she said, because her own eyes were filling. "We're not crying." "I'm not crying," he said, which was true, but his jaw was working. "This is fine," she said. "We're both fine." "We're very fine," he agreed. They sat there at the breakfast table being fine at each other until she laughed, and he laughed, and she got up and went around the table, and he pulled her into his arms from the chair and held on, and she pressed her face against his hair, and thought that this was what she had walked 43 miles through Nebraska for, had taken every rough year of her life toward, had stood on cracked alkaline earth and dared to grow something on this exact moment, this specific warmth. The baby came in May of 1881, as she had predicted. He was a boy, which surprised Abigail in the specific way of something you had not quite realized you hoped for until it happened. He came into the world on a Sunday morning with more volume and apparent objection than his quiet, serious father and his composed, methodical mother would have led anyone to predict, and he was red-faced and furious about everything for approximately 20 minutes, and then settled into a focused, alert attention to his surroundings that was, Isaiah said, already considerably more organized than his own first impressions. They named him Thomas Henry Doyle Thomas for Isaiah's father, Henry for Abigail's. Mrs. Garfield came to see the baby within 48 hours and cried openly and without apology. Mr. Prout, the attorney who had driven Abigail out to see the alkaline flats 3 years ago and had offered his condolences, drove out with a small carved wooden horse for the baby, and stood in the doorway of the house looking around at everything Abigail had built with an expression of wondering disbelief that she found very satisfying. "Miss Hale, Mrs. Doyle, I want to say," he said, holding his hat in his hands. "When I brought you out here and I saw how you looked at that land, I thought you would be disappointed eventually, and I am very glad that I was wrong." "Thank you, Mr. Prout," she said. "I thought I would be disappointed too. But I kept working, and it turned out different." Isaiah shook Mr. Prout's hand and walked him to his buggy, and Abigail stood in the doorway of her house with Thomas Henry against her shoulder, his small, substantial weight warm through her dress, and looked out at the lavender in full bloom now, a 4th year's blooming, richer and more established than ever, the purple running in long rows out to the fence line, and the stone building behind the house where the copper still worked through the harvest season, and the kitchen garden on the shaded slope with its neat rows of herbs, and the new fence posts Isaiah's men had put in along the western boundary last fall, and the sign she had finally relented and put on the gate, carved by one of Isaiah's ranch hands who had a gift for woodwork, Doyle Lavender Farm, established 1878. She had wanted to put Hale Doyle, and Isaiah had said it should be her name first, and she had said it should be both names, and they had argued about it in the pleasant, productive way they argued about things, which was to say that they made their points clearly and listened to each other carefully, and arrived at a position that was better than either of them had started with. And the compromise had been Doyle, which carried both of them, and she had decided she was content with that. The perfumery in San Francisco was now receiving quarterly shipments of lavender oil, and the relationship had been formalized the previous winter in a contract that guaranteed Abigail a minimum price per ounce for the next 3 years, with a provision for renegotiation based on market conditions. The dry goods merchant in Virginia City had become her largest buyer of dried lavender bundles. She had begun a small correspondence business, selling lavender sachets through a catalog, an enterprise she had started because a woman in Ohio had written asking whether she could purchase lavender by post. She had smelled it in a bundle purchased at a trading post and had not been able to stop thinking about it, and the answer had turned out to be yes. She had also, in the fall of 1880, quietly and without making an announcement about it, prepared and planted 2 apple trees and 3 pear trees in the most sheltered corner of the property, where the ridge wall and the kitchen garden slope created a natural windbreak. They were young trees, not producing yet, but the idea of them, of the orchard she had mentioned to Isaiah in that very first conversation in his kitchen in May of 1878, made her feel a deep, particular satisfaction. Isaiah had seen the trees going in and had said nothing, only given her that look, the private, specific one, and gone to help her dig the holes. The summer of 1881 brought a visiting party that none of them had anticipated. A group of women from a newly formed women's agricultural society in Carson City had heard about the Doyle lavender farm through the Nevada State Journal article and through subsequent word of mouth, and they wrote requesting permission to visit and study the operation. They were serious, organized women, a teacher, a rancher's wife, a widow who ran her own small orchard, a young woman who had just taken up a homestead claim under the Homestead Act and was trying to figure out what to do with it. They arrived on a Thursday morning in 3 wagons and spent the full day at the property. Abigail showed them everything. She walked them through the lavender beds and explained the soil remediation process in practical detail, the gypsum treatment, the ryegrass rotation, the years it had taken and what each year had required. She showed them the irrigation channel and the diversion wall in the creek bed and explained how it worked. She walked them through the distillation building and demonstrated the still operation, explaining the steam process and the oil yield and the economics of the lavender oil versus the dried bundle market. She let them taste the herbs from the kitchen garden and showed them her accounts, which were organized and current, and showed a homestead that had moved from financial fragility in its first year to modest but solid profitability in its third. The young woman who had just filed her homestead claim stood in the lavender beds with her eyes very wide and said, "Can I ask, when you first saw this land, did you know it would work? Or were you guessing?" Abigail considered the question honestly. "I was reasoning," she said. "I had information. I had studied what I could. But I didn't know. No one knows. You can reason and prepare as well as possible and still not know. You just have to start and keep going. What if it had failed? Then I would have learned something," Abigail said, "and tried to do something else with that knowledge." She paused. "I won't pretend I wasn't frightened. I was, but fear doesn't have to stop you. It can just ride along. It's uncomfortable company, but it doesn't have to drive." The young woman looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, in a way that meant something larger than gratitude for a practical answer. Isaiah was home for the dinner that Abigail and Mrs. Garfield, who had driven out for the occasion, prepared for the visiting party, and he sat at the end of the long table they had set up on the covered porch and watched his wife hold a table of 10 women in the particular way she held things, through the quality of her attention, through an honesty that never condescended, through the clear evidence of her own accomplished work. And he had the look again, the one she collected. She caught his eye once across the table, and he raised his coffee cup slightly in a small, private toast, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like weather. By the time Thomas Henry Doyle took his first steps on the kitchen floor in October of 1881, grabbing the table leg for support, and then releasing it with an expression of astonished determination, and staggering 4 steps to his father's outstretched hands before sitting down hard on the flagstones, and looking enormously pleased with himself. The Doyle Lavender Farm was producing more lavender oil and dried product than any other operation in the Nevada Territory. Was known to people as far away as Salt Lake City and Sacramento and Portland, and had been visited by more than 300 people since the Nevada State Journal article had run. One of Isaiah's hands had taken to calling it the Purple Place when speaking to strangers trying to find it, and the name had stuck in the way that stuck names do, and people now asked for the Purple Place, and everyone in Dust Creek knew exactly where they meant. Abigail had stopped objecting to the name. She had even, privately, come to like it. The apple trees flowered for the first time in the spring of 1882, 3 years after she had planted them, which was exactly when she had calculated they would, and she stood in front of them in the April light with the blossoms open around her, small and white, and impossibly delicate against the harshness of the Nevada landscape, and felt the accumulation of years in the moment. The cracked alkaline earth that she had stood on in May of 1878. The purple-stained fingers of the first harvest, the water running in the channel for the first time in the August rain, Isaiah's hand covering hers on the creek bed rock, the first kiss with a cedar chip in her hair, the wedding in January cold. Thomas Henry's fury at arriving in the world, the apple trees going in the ground on a fall afternoon with Isaiah digging holes beside her and no need to explain why. She pressed her hand flat against the bark of the nearest tree and said, quietly into the blossoming air, "Look at that." Thomas Henry was at her knee, 18 months old and solemnly interested in everything, and he put his own small hand on the tree bark beside hers and looked up at her with Isaiah's eyes dark brown, serious, carrying more depth than the face yet knew how to express, and she picked him up and held him and showed him the blossoms at eye level, and he reached out and touched one petal with one careful finger and looked at her with an expression that was pure wonder. "Flower," she told him. "Flower," he said. "Close enough," she said. Isaiah appeared at the corner of the building, coming from the direction of the distillation shed where he had been helping with a new batch. He looked at them, his wife and son at the apple tree in the April light, and he stopped walking and simply looked, the way he stopped for things that mattered, and Abigail looked back at him over Thomas Henry's dark head, and the world was very full. In the summer of 1882, the Carson City paper ran a second piece about the Doyle lavender farm, longer than the first, under a headline that Abigail kept a copy of folded in her account book for the rest of her life. The most talked about homestead in the West. How one woman turned alkaline nothing into a fragrant empire. It was a somewhat grand title for 40 acres of lavender and an herb garden in Churchill County, Nevada, but the woman who had written it, a journalist who had visited twice and was thorough in her research, made the case with enough specific evidence that even Abigail could not entirely argue against it. The piece traveled, as good journalism does. It was picked up by papers in San Francisco and Salt Lake City and Denver, and by the end of the year Abigail was receiving letters from women across the West asking about land remediation and lavender cultivation and the economics of farm direct marketing, and she answered every one of them because she remembered standing in the creek bed, not knowing whether the wall would hold, and knowing that any knowledge she could give would matter. Virgil Hennessy, for his part, had not improved significantly in disposition, but he had stopped coming to the fence line with complaints, and the previous spring his wife, a quiet woman named Dorothea who had the particular quality of patience of someone who has spent decades adjusting for someone else's bad temper, had appeared at the farm gate alone and asked, simply and without any mention of her husband, whether she might buy 2 lavender bundles. Abigail had sold her the bundles and also given her a small bunch of dried chamomile from the herb garden, and said that chamomile tea was good for anxiety, which Dorothea had taken with a look that was almost comic in its weary recognition, and the 2 women had talked for 20 minutes at the gate and had become, in the careful way of women who understand each other's situations, something very like friends. Isaiah's youngest sister, Clara, 23, recently widowed after a brief marriage ended by a fever epidemic, and now living in Sacramento with her older sister, came to visit in the fall of 1882 and stayed for 2 months. She was, in the way of the Doyle family, direct and self-contained and quietly observant, and she watched her brother and Abigail for 3 days without saying much and then announced over dinner, "You two are the only married people I have ever known who actually seem to enjoy each other." Isaiah said, "That is an extremely low bar, Clara." "It is," she agreed, "which makes your clearing it all the more impressive." Abigail laughed, and Clara looked at her and smiled in the way of a woman who has decided to trust someone, and the two became friends in the straightforward, non-performative way that suited them both. Clara, it turned out, had a talent for bookkeeping that she had never had particular occasion to use, and she helped Abigail reorganize the farm's accounts over the 2 months of her visit, establishing a system that was clearer and more forward-looking than what Abigail had been maintaining alone. She also had a habit in the evenings of reading aloud from whatever book was to hand. She had a carrying voice and good instincts about pacing, and the three of them fell into a domestic pattern during those weeks that felt both temporary and essentially complete, a pocket of warmth in the cooling Nevada fall. And when Clara left in November, Abigail felt the house quiet in a way that told her she had made a true friend. Thomas Henry at 18 months had become, predictably, a small but determined force of opinion on all matters within his range of awareness, and his range was expanding rapidly. He regarded the lavender beds with the proprietary interest of a person who feels vaguely that anything within sight belongs to them, and he liked to walk the rows with Abigail in the mornings and periodically grab at a stem, and then look at the scent on his hand with an expression of strong-minded deliberation. Isaiah took him to the creek bed one morning to show him the diversion wall and spent an hour crouching beside him explaining the rocks while Thomas Henry examined each one with complete solemnity and stacked them in configurations of his own design. "He's building something," Isaiah said to Abigail that evening. "His own wall," she said. "Or a monument," Isaiah said. "It's hard to tell with him. He has your certainty," she said. "He has your stubbornness." "We are going to be in a great deal of trouble when he's older," she said. "Enormous trouble," he agreed. "I find myself looking forward to it." She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the lamplight that had become her favorite time of day. This hour at the end of the day's work when they sat together and let the conversation run wherever it wanted, with Thomas Henry already in bed above them, and the house settling into its evening sounds and the lavender fields dark outside the window. She had a thing to tell him, which she had been saving for this moment. "Isaiah," she said, "I believe Thomas Henry will have company sometime around June." The quiet in the kitchen was the listening kind. He looked at her with the expression she knew, the opening one, the unguarded one, the one she had first seen when he heard the news of Thomas Henry's coming, and that had not diminished with repetition. "June," he said. "Approximately," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair so that he was looking up at her, which was not something he did often. He was not, by nature, demonstrative in the showy way, and he took her face in his hands very gently, and looked at her with everything he had, all the seriousness and warmth and certainty, and said, very quietly, "I love you, Abigail Hale." He used her name, her own name, not his, which he did sometimes and which she had never asked him to stop because it felt like him seeing her, specifically, the self that had existed before him and continued inside the life they had made together. She covered his hands with hers. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite some time, since approximately the second Tuesday in May," he laughed. It was the real laugh, the full one, rare and brilliant, and she put her arms around his neck and held on, and outside the window the lavender made its invisible fragrant presence in the Nevada dark, and the well held water, and the apple trees were growing, and the root cellar on the shaded slope held the winter's stored provisions, and somewhere up the ridge the diversion wall waited patiently for the next season's rain. The second child arrived in May of 1883, as Abigail had predicted, because she was her mother's daughter and she was always serious. She was a girl this time, which neither of them had a preference about but which felt complete in the particular way of things that have found their right form. She arrived with considerably more equanimity than Thomas Henry had shown, calm and observant from the first, wide dark eyes taking in the ceiling of the bedroom, with what the doctor called unusual alertness for a newborn, and what Isaiah, looking at her, called clearly your child, to which Abigail responded that she was clearly both their child, and perhaps the argument was premature. They named her Margaret Clara Doyle, Margaret for Abigail's mother, and Clara for Isaiah's sister, who was informed by letter, and wrote back from Sacramento with an exclamation point in the middle of a sentence, which everyone who knew her understood was the equivalent of anyone else weeping with joy. Thomas Henry, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the careful, territorial attention of a small person, accustomed to being the only one, and working out what this development meant for the established order. He brought her a rock from the creek bed on her second day home, a smooth flat one of the kind he had been collecting for months, and placed it on the edge of her cradle with the air of someone making a formal gift. Isaiah watched this and said nothing, and later, in the kitchen, told Abigail with a quietly moved expression that he thought their son had just made a peace offering and possibly established the terms of a long relationship. The lavender farm, in its 5th year of operation, was a serious enterprise. Abigail had expanded the cultivated area to nearly 30 of the 40 acres. The remaining 10, the most stubbornly alkaline section closest to the ridge base, she was still working, adding gypsum and organic material each year in the patient knowledge that soil remediation did not hurry. The distillation operation was now producing enough oil to maintain 3 ongoing supply contracts in addition to the San Francisco perfumery. She had hired 3 full-time workers, 2 women and a man named Cato who had come west from Missouri and who had a genius for irrigation systems that immediately elevated the quality of her water management far beyond what she had built herself. She paid them fairly and kept regular hours, and they stayed, which she considered the truest indicator of the correctness of her approach. She had also finally written the cultivation and remediation guide that the Women's Agricultural Society in Carson City had been asking her to write for 2 years. A practical, unsentimental document of about 30 pages that explained in specific detail how to assess and treat alkaline soil, how to establish a lavender cultivation operation in the Nevada high desert, and how to approach the distillation and marketing of lavender oil. She had it printed in Carson City at her own expense and sold it through the Agricultural Society for 20 cents a copy, and she made no particular claims about it, but it sold steadily month after month, and letters came back from women who had used it and found it useful, and she kept those letters in a cedar box in the bedroom. Isaiah read the guide in one evening and said, the next morning, "You should write another one." About what? About everything else. The marketing, the contracts, the correspondence catalog, the things you figured out after the soil work. She looked at him. "You want me to write a book? I want you to write down what you know," he said. "Because more people need to know it than can come visit the purple place." She considered this for a long time. Then she began writing. It was slow, because she was also running a farm and raising 2 children and managing 3 employees and maintaining supplier relationships and keeping accounts and everything else that made up the dense practical fabric of her days. But she wrote steadily, in the evenings after the children were in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and Isaiah often across from her with his own account books or with whatever he was reading, the comfortable silence of 2 people working companionably in the same space. By the spring of 1884, in the 6th year of the Doyle lavender farm, Abigail had a manuscript of about 140 pages. It was called Isaiah Had Made the Suggestion, which she had initially resisted, and then, upon consideration, accepted, starting from nothing, a practical guide to frontier homesteading for women. She sent it to a publisher in San Francisco who had been recommended to her by the journalist from the Carson City paper, and after 3 months of correspondence that required all of her most patient persistence, it was accepted for publication. Thomas Henry turned 3 in May. Margaret Clara turned 1. The apple trees produced their first small harvest, 14 apples from the 2 trees, which she collected as though they were precious things, which they were, and made into a pie that Isaiah ate 2 slices of and declared the best thing he had ever tasted, which she thought was an exaggeration but a lovely one. The pear trees were not far behind. Dust Creek itself had changed in 6 years, in the way of western towns that have decided to stay. There were more buildings now. A second general store, a proper doctor's office, a small school that Abigail had been quietly instrumental in establishing through a combination of advocacy and donated money, a post office that handled the increased correspondence of a town that had become something of a regional point of interest, partly because of the lavender farm, and partly because the railroad company was considering a spur line from the main route, which had the property speculators arriving with their measuring equipment and their inflated estimates. Isaiah had expanded the ranch's cattle operation incrementally over the same period, taking advantage of several good weather years to improve his grazing land and increase his herd. He and Abigail had settled, over years, into a working partnership that was the most functional arrangement Abigail had ever observed, each of them managing their own domain with full competence, consulting each other when it was genuinely useful, and maintaining the kind of mutual respect that does not require constant negotiation, because the terms are clear and have been honored consistently. He rode out to the lavender farm every evening from the ranch. In the early days it had been 6 miles, which was nothing on a good horse. As their lives organized themselves, he spent more time at the farmhouse than at the ranch house. He had good men and trusted them, and the ranch ran well, and the farmhouse was where his family was, and he was, beneath the self-contained exterior, a man who oriented strongly toward his family and who would never have said this out loud but who everyone who knew him understood clearly. Mrs. Garfield had died quietly in her sleep in the winter of 1882, which was a loss that Abigail felt with a specific sadness. The woman had been her first friend in Dust Creek, had given her shelter and information, and biscuits with occasional ham, and a robust honesty about the impracticality of the lavender project that had somehow managed to be both discouraging and encouraging at the same time. Abigail went to the funeral with Thomas Henry on her hip and stood at the grave in the January cold and said goodbye to the first chapter of her life in Dust Creek, which Mrs. Garfield had witnessed whole. The boarding house was purchased by a couple from Utah who kept it running competently and who replaced the biscuits with occasional ham policy with a more varied breakfast menu, which was progress, but somehow not quite the same thing. Mr. Prout retired in 1883 and moved to live with a daughter in San Francisco, and before he left, he came to the farm one last time to say goodbye and walked the lavender beds with Abigail in the summer morning with a reverent expression and said, very sincerely, "I have never in my professional life been so glad to have delivered bad news." "You should put that on your professional card," Abigail said. He laughed. It was one of the nicer things she had made happen for someone. The spring of 1885, in the 7th year of the farm and the 6th year of their marriage, was the spring that the book came out. Starting from Nothing was published by a San Francisco press in March of 1885, in an edition of 500 copies, which sold out in 6 weeks, requiring a second printing, which also sold well, particularly along the frontier territories where women were taking up homestead claims under the 1862 Act in significant numbers, and looking for exactly the kind of practical, specific guidance that Abigail had spent years acquiring the hard way. The editor wrote her a letter after the first edition sold out calling the book the most useful agricultural text written by an American woman since the frontier opened, which Abigail read twice and filed in her cedar box and did not mention to anyone except Isaiah, who read the letter and said, "Only an American woman." "I think he meant it as a compliment," she said. "He should have said finest agricultural text, period," Isaiah said, which was, from Isaiah Doyle, an extravagance of praise, and she loved him very much in that moment. She was 33 years old in 1885. Isaiah was 39. Thomas Henry was 4 and had opinions about everything with a force of commitment that sometimes reduced his parents to helpless laughter and sometimes required significant diplomatic management. Margaret Clara at 2 was quieter than her brother, but observed everything with a quality of attention that made both her parents faintly nervous, in the way of people who recognize themselves clearly in a small person. The orchard, by 1885, was producing steadily, the 2 apple trees and 3 pear trees yielding enough fruit in a good year to supply their own kitchen and allow Abigail to sell small quantities to the general store. She had added 2 more apple trees the previous fall, and the orchard corner of the property, sheltered by the ridge wall and the kitchen garden slope, had become one of her favorite places on the land, green and fragrant and productive in a different register from the lavender, less dramatic but somehow deeply satisfying, the way lasting things are. She brought Margaret Clara there on a September afternoon in 1885 to pick the apple harvest, with Thomas Henry helping, which meant primarily eating apples and occasionally placing one in the basket with an air of significant contribution. And she thought about the October morning in 1878, when she had stood on this land for the first time and seen nothing. And the distance between that morning and this one was so large and so full that she could not hold it all at once. She settled for holding what she could. The weight of an apple in her hand, the smell of it, her daughter's dark curls in the September light, her son's running feet across the grass, the ridge above them making its long, familiar shadow. Isaiah came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw them, the 3 of them in the orchard in the afternoon light, and she watched the expression move across his face, the one without a name, and she raised the apple in her hand toward him slightly, an offering, and he came and took it from her and bit into it and made a sound of satisfied appreciation. And she leaned her shoulder against his, and they stood in the orchard in the Nevada September, and listened to Thomas Henry tell them about a very important rock he had found and Margaret Clara's serious commentary on a caterpillar she had discovered on the ground, and the lavender was still growing in its rows beyond the orchard, and the well was holding water, and the diversion wall was in the creek bed waiting for the next rain. The last of the alkaline sections, the 10 acres closest to the ridge base that Abigail had been working for 7 years, was ready for planting the following spring. She prepared it through the fall and winter of 1885, and in the spring of 1886 she planted it with lavender, the final beds, and stood at the top of the property and looked down at the whole of it, all 40 acres, the full sweep from the fence line to the ridge, covered now in lavender and herb garden and orchard and the 2 buildings and the outbuilding with the copper still, and felt the satisfaction of a thing completed, not finished. She was clear-eyed about the difference. The farm would continue to grow and change and demand and surprise her. There were plans for a second distillation still to increase oil production. There was a proposal from the Women's Agricultural Society to use the property for a seasonal workshop for women homesteaders. There was a letter from a woman in Colorado who wanted to visit and discuss establishing a similar operation in the Rocky Mountain foothills, and the conversation promised to be interesting. Nothing was finished, but something was completed, the first thing. The original vision, 40 acres of alkaline, nothing turned into 40 acres of productive, fragrant, living land, was now fully realized, and she stood at the top of it in the spring of 1886 and acknowledged that with the attention it deserved. Isaiah came and stood beside her. Thomas Henry was 5½ and at school in Dust Creek, which he attended with fierce dedication, and came home from with opinions about history and arithmetic and the moral character of his classmates. Margaret Clara at 3 was home with Cato's wife, who helped with the children on work days and would be brought out to the farm by mid-morning. They stood together at the top of the property and looked down at all of it. "I keep thinking," Abigail said, "about the first time I stood on this land and thought, what on earth am I going to do with this?" "What did you decide?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "That I would figure it out as I went," she said. "And did you?" She looked at him. He was looking at her, the way he had looked at her across the lavender rows that very first morning she had visited his ranch, when she had said she was planning to grow lavender and he had said it was either the smartest idea he'd heard or she'd been reading the wrong books. The same look. 7 years had not changed it. If anything, it was stronger, more settled, more itself. "Yes," she said. "I figured it out as I went, with some help. I moved some rocks," he said. "You moved a great many rocks," she said. "And brought lumber and dug a well and built a house and helped raise 2 children and read my entire book in draft form and told me to write a second one and stood beside me at every fence line when it counted." He was quiet. Then he said, "I also brought Scratch that first day at the creek bed." "Scratch had excellent timing," she said. "He broke the tension at a critical moment." "He was a very good dog," Isaiah agreed solemnly. Scratch had died the previous winter, old and gray-muzzled and in his sleep, and they had both felt it, the particular grief of an animal that has been present at your important moments. "I want to plant something for Scratch," she said. "In the orchard. A tree." "He would have eaten the apples," Isaiah said. "He would have," she agreed. "All the more reason." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. The wind came up from the west and moved through the lavender below them in a long wave, the purple rippling and the scent rising and the whole 40 acres shimmering with 7 years of labor and care and stubbornness and love and the particular kind of hope that is not wishful but worked for. "Abigail," he said quietly. "Isaiah," she said. "I am glad," he said, "that you inherited the worst piece of land in Churchill County." She laughed. She laughed with everything she had, there at the top of the lavender farm in the Nevada spring, with his arm around her, and the purple fields below them and the apple trees in the orchard corner, and the root cellar on the shaded slope, and the house with its covered porch and the outbuilding with the copper still, and the creek bed with its diversion wall and all of it made from nothing, from cracked alkaline earth and 43 cents, and the kind of stubbornness that does not ask permission. "So am I," she said. The wind moved through the lavender again, long and warm, and carried the scent of it across the valley toward Dusk Creek and beyond, the way it did every spring now, and every person in the valley who smelled it knew exactly where it came from. The most talked-about homestead in the West stood in the Nevada high desert and bloomed and bloomed and bloomed.